Welcome, viewers and listeners, to Island Vibes, a weekly podcast where we look at things Caribbean, the islands, the people, the culture, politics, and way of life. Today, we will be looking at events unfolding the morning of Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, in the Caribbean Basin, namely with the arrest of Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, along with his wife, on allegations by the U.S. on drug trafficking and weapons possessions, arms possessions, among other charges. In the early hours of Saturday morning, Nicolas Maduro was arrested by the U.S. military to be indicted on the charges, for which it is alleged he was involved in, he and his government. The U.S. had been stationed in the Caribbean region, with their military presence for some time now, some months. And they have been engaged in raids on small boats that was alleged to have been carrying drugs. And a number of these boats were bombed. And, there was loss of life. And there was much outrage, particularly from the Caribbean islands, the leaders of the Caribbean islands, on first of all, the U.S. strong military presence in the region, which they deem to be a zone of peace, and particularly with the indiscriminate method in which the U.S. was going about with their bombings. But we know for some time now the U.S. have been targeting Maduro and signaling his possible arrest or capture, and their presence, no doubt, was a build-up to that. And in fact, he and his administration were at some point labeled a terrorist organization, and that was the pretext for engaging, militarily against his administration. So it wasn't a surprise that he was arrested. What was a surprise, or what was unexpected, was how quickly it was done and how easily, and owing to the fact that just the day before that he had agreed to engage in making a deal with the U.S. administration. Prior to that, we had warnings coming from the nations of China and Russia, of the U.S. possible invasion of, against the U.S. possible invasion of Venezuela, and whatever actions that they would have taken against Nicolas Maduro and his administration. We know these two nations, China and Russia, have been supportive of the Venezuelan regime. And people were expecting, some sort of retaliatory action from these two nations, in response to the U.S. attack on Venezuela and the arrest of Maduro. But I don't believe that these two nations, that was their primary interest. While they did support Venezuela militarily, with the supply of arms and so, their primary interest, particularly China, I think China's primary interest is not military might, although they do have military might because they are one of the superpowers, in the world militarily. But China's primary focus right now is on economic power. And I don't think that in their wisdom, they wanted to get involved in a military conflict with the U.S., which is one of their largest trading partners. After, one of the U.S.'s largest trading partners after Canada and Mexico. China is their third largest trade partner. So I don't think they wanted to get involved in a conflict militarily with the U.S. And Russia, on the other hand, have been engaged in a battle, in a war with Ukraine for the past couple years, and a battle that they thought at some point would have been very easy and that Ukraine would have been a walkover. But with the resistance of the military, the Ukrainian military, they have been, the Russian military have been depleted over the years, fighting that war, and I don't think they wanted to, or they would have wanted to get into a conflict with the U.S. over Venezuela. What was most interesting, and it was the silence of the Caribbean islands, conspicuously so the past couple of days. We know a few days ago, that the Prime Minister of Dominica, Roosevelt Skerrit, offered to be an intermediary, to mediate between the U.S. administration and the Venezuelan administration. We know of his close relationship to Maduro, but that didn't pan out, and we have not heard much from the leaders of the Caribbean islands, particularly those affiliated with ALBA, and ALBA is an arrangement set up by the Venezuelan government under the late Hugo Chavez. We have not heard much from leaders of those ALBA nations, in terms of their support for Venezuela and their condemnation of the U.S. We heard of it earlier, but in recent days they have been conspicuously silent, and particularly, with the U.S. imposing visa restrictions on some of those islands that started or took effect on January 1st. There was much bickering among the CARICOM leaders, particularly against the Trinidad Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar, who was the lone leader of the region in support of the U.S.'s actions, the U.S.'s presence, and it's left to be seen how this, the arrest of Maduro is going to play out with, that relationship between Trinidad and the rest of CARICOM. But more importantly, how the arrest of Nicolas Maduro is going to affect the Caribbean islands, particularly those involved in ALBA, who have been reliant on Venezuela for, petroleum products, that supply their energy sectors. We expect that there's likely to be a regime change in Venezuela. In the interim, it was said in the early hours of Saturday morning that the vice president would have taken over, in the interim, until probably a new administration, would come in. And we know the U.S. have been supportive of the opposition, but I would imagine that there at some point would be an election, and the U.S. no doubt would probably be supporting the opposition, but the implications for possible regime change in Venezuela is what should be of concern to the Caribbean islands, and how that is going to affect them, with their Petrocarib and ALBA arrangements. The Venezuelan administration have supported the Caribbean islands financially, otherwise outside of Petrocarib and the whole energy sector. It's left to be seen how Trinidad itself is going to be affected, in that relationship with Venezuela as well, because we know that they have had relationship with the Venezuelan administration. They have arrangements, in the oil industry, and it's left to be seen how that's going to be affecting them as well. But the islands definitely are going to be affected in some way, and particularly with the visa restrictions imposed on the Caribbean islands, that is also going to compound the situation for some of the ALBA nations. And it's going to be an interesting time for the Caribbean islands, and the leaders, at some point, I would imagine, would need to sit together and try to figure a way out, probably, engage in the U.S. administration and whatever new administration that may be possible in Venezuela, to see how they can, work their way out of these two situations. The CBI, the fallout of the CBI program, because visa restrictions is definitely going to affect the CBI program, and with the arrest of Maduro and the possible repercussions for their energy sector, with Petrocarib most likely being affected by the arrest of Maduro, and I'm expecting that in the next couple of days we are going to hear, some discussion along those lines, and what all of that means, for the Caribbean islands, the recent activities in the Caribbean basin. And I do hope that these islands can find a way out of this, because both situations, the CBI program and Petrocarib were two things that the islands depended on heavily, and the loss or whatever negative impact that comes from the recent activities, concerning those two programs will definitely affect those islands, and some way forward, has to be considered, and I do hope that something can be achieved, going forward, in terms of a resolution or some other means of accessing revenue, or probably engaging the U.S. administration, like I said, and whatever other administration that may, take over in Venezuela, with a view to getting back some of the economic stability that they once had, depending on those two programs, the Petrocari program and the CBI program. So this brings us to the end of today's broadcast. Until next time, do have a pleasant day.